and welcome to week 12 of English 121. This week we're going to be talking about sound in poetry. We're also going to be talking about how to write about poetry, and I'll be introducing your next formal assignment to you where you will write about poetry. You'll need to read 2 chapters this week. The first one is on sound. You're also going to want to read chapter 43, which is called Writing About a Poem, and that's found on pages 1933 to 1954. In our conversation this week, we're going to be analyzing sound in a poem by Sylvia Plath. And in week 12 reflection, in your week 12 reflection journal, you're going to do the pre-writing for your poetry paper. All right, well, let's talk a little bit about the terminology of sound. But before we do so, I wanted to start with a quotation from T.S. Eliot. That's that guy right there in the bottom right-hand corner. I would remind you first that the music of poetry is not something which exists apart from the meaning. What he means by this quotation is the fact that in poetry, sound and meaning are equally important. When you make choices as a writer about sound, they affect the meaning of the poem. And the way you play with sound can enhance the meaning in many ways. Some of the ways you play with sound in a poem are these terms. And the reason why I do go over all these terms with you is so that you can use them in your writing. So please make sure as you're preparing to write your essay on poetry that you are looking at how each poem that you choose to write on you look at these particular terms and figure out how you can use them to talk about that poem. So in euphony, that's the harmonious effect when the sounds of the words connect with the meaning in a pleasing way. This is the opposite of cacophony. So euphony, which even sounds like what it is, there's an example of euphony that is in our book. And this is from Tennyson's O Come Down, O Maid. Myriads of rivulets hurrying through the lawn, the moan of doves in immemorial elms, and murmuring of sorry, my tongue got tied. And murmuring of innumerable bees. You can see that the words are, they sound sweet and nice, they sound soothing, they're creating a soothing picture of a safe, beautiful place, okay? Cacophony, which is the opposite, is a harsh, discordant sound that often mirrors the meaning of the context in which it's used, and this is, the opposite. Here's an example. Grate on their scrannel pipes of wretched straw, right? You hear the harsh sounds that are emphasizing the harsh thoughts in the poem. These are words that you can easily use to talk about how a poem that's flowing sweetly, the poet is usually using euphony as a way to soothe the reader into understanding. Versus cacophony, where the poet is trying to wake up the reader to the meaning that he or she is communicating. Onomatopoeia is an attempt to represent a thing or action by a word that imitates the sound that's associated with it. A really popular place you see onomatopoeia is in comic books, like pow, zap, boom, right? Those are all onomatopoeia words. But words like buzz, right? That sounds like a bee's buzz. That's onomatopoeia. Whiz, zoom, crash, bang. A lot of sound words are onomatopoeia. Alliteration is very important in conveying meaning in a poem, and this is the repetition of consonant sounds in a line of verse or prose. Alliteration can be used at the beginning of words. This is called initial alliteration, and you see it in the phrase cool cats. You hear k, cool, and k, cats. Or internally, such as I met a traveler from an antique land. It's traveler and antique, teak, are bouncing. The sounds are bouncing off each other. What alliteration provides in a poem is flow. It makes a poem smooth. Assonance is a repetition of two or more vowel sounds in successive words. And an example of that, sorry, I'm trying to find the example in the book to show you. Assonance is found in on page 816. Her goodly eyes like sapphires shining bright. So it's a repetition of the vowel sound. So in on page 816 in Edmund Spenser's quotation, her goodly eyes, so eyes, like eye, sapphires eye, shining eye, bright eye. Her forehead ivory white, right? All of those eyes keep the flow of the poem together. All right, well, let's try to understand how this works all together. This poem, God's Grandeur, is one of Gerard Manley Hopkins, and it's one of his more famous poems. I'm going to read it to you. I also provided a link to so you can listen to a recording of the poem, which is a beautiful recording. I'm also going to, there's a link here too, so you can learn more about Gerard Manley Hopkins. One of the things that's really interesting about him is that when he composed his poems while he was walking, and you can hear that kind of rhythm when you listen to his poem. God's Grandeur. The world is charged with the grandeur of God. It will flame out like shining from shook foil. It gathers to a greatness like the ooze of oil crushed. Why do men then now not wreck his rod? Generations have trod, and all is seared with trade, bleared, smeared with toil, and wears man's smudge, and shares man's smell. The soil is bare now, nor can foot feel being shod. And for all this, nature is never spent. There lives the dearest freshness deep down in things, and though there lives the dearest freshness deep down in things, and though the last lights off the black west went, oh, morning at the brown brink eastward springs, because the Holy Ghost over the bent world broods with warm breast and bright wings. So if we look closely at this poem, we see that it is filled with alliteration, with assonance, with onomatopoeia, right? Right? There is so much sound work going on in this poem. If we just look closely, the world is charged with the grandeur of God. We've got charged with grandeur and God, right? There's a cacophony going on here because of the guttural sounds, right? The g. There's also alliteration, right? Charged, grandeur, and God. It will flame out like shining from shook foil, right? The shining and shook, again, alliterate. It gathers to a greatness, like the ooze of oil, assonance, ooze of oil crushed. So what I'd like you to do is to look at this poem yourself and think about it. Why do you suppose Hopkins, point out some of his use of alliteration and assonance, and see for yourself, do you think it's over the top? There's a lot of it. Or do you think that it adds to the meaning of the poem? It definitely is a dramatic poem because of it. But I want you to think about, why did he use so much alliteration and assonance? and think about, is the poem euphonic, right? Does it flow? Or is it cacophonous? Or is it both? And where is it cacophonous? And where is it euphonous? So really think about the flow of the poem. And I'd like you to listen to it again. If you click on the link here, you'll be able to listen to it read to you. And think about the effects that all of these sound effects basically have on the meaning of the poem. So when you are reading a poem to try to understand, the sound in the poem. So if you were looking at God's grandeur and you really wanted to figure out how is he using sound to enhance the meaning of the poem, you don't want to look at everything at once because it would be absolutely overwhelming in that poem. But you do want to read through the poem several times and find the main auditory elements. Maybe just look at alliteration and assonance and how he's using that in the poem. And try to figure out how the alliteration and assonance add to the meaning of each line. How does it help us understand what the line is about? And you'll need to know what the line is about in order to answer that question. And as you read through the poem, you want to let your data build before you come to a conclusion. So read a poem openly. You'll have a feeling in your gut about if it's good, bad, if you like it, you dislike it, but get data to support your feelings as a way to write cohesively about it. And then how does the sound of the words add to a poem's mood? What is the mood of Hopkins' poem? You can tell us what it is based on the data you have to support it. So for today's poem, and for this week's discussion, we're going to be talking about Sylvia Plath's poem Daddy. I'd like you to start by silently reading her poem Daddy, which is in Poems for Further Reading. Then I'd like you to read the poem aloud. You can also listen to a recording of Sylvia Plath herself reading the poem on the link below. What did you perceive about the poem after reading it aloud that you hadn't noticed before? Then I want you to closely read the poem, and that includes looking up allusions and references. I want you to read for sound and sense, so what it means, right? And post your response. You can also get more information about Sylvia Plath by reading this link to a biography here. As always, you need to post your conversation by 11:59 p.m. on Saturday, and I really look forward to your discussion on this topic. Alright, so the other thing we're going to be talking about this week is how to write about poetry, because you are going to be writing about poetry. So even before you begin writing, after you look at your the prompt that I'll give you, you want to choose a poem that's speaking to you. So you don't want to write about poems that you don't like, because it'll be difficult for you to connect with it. So choose poems that speak to you. And then allow yourself time to get comfortable with your subject. Who wrote the poem? Find out information about the poet or poets. Read the poem many times so that you really feel a connection to it. Then after you've done that, you really want to actively read it. So try reading the poem aloud. You want to annotate the poem. So if you look at page 1934, there's a good example of how to read the poem and note on the poem, where you see assonance, where you see a metaphor, where you see, and start using your terminology as you point out things that are happening in the poem. If there are any unfamiliar words in the poem, look them up. We learned how the dictionary can really change the meaning of a poem. If there's any references or allusions, look them up and try to understand them. Then you want to think about the poem. Give yourself time to think about it. Once you choose your poem, read it, take a day, read it again, take another day, read it again, and let yourself sink into the poem. Poetry takes time to fully understand, and the more time you give yourself, the better. You want to let your emotions really guide you into the poem. You're going to choose a poem based on a gut reaction, right? You're going to choose a poem that you like, that you like an image in, or you like the sound of, And I want you to use that as a way to connect with the poem. And then after you do so, you want to determine what is literally happening in the poem. You want to separate literal language from figurative or symbolic language, but it's a tough thing to do, but it's really important. So begin by working out the literal. Who's speaking the poem? And who's the person speaking to? Under what circumstances? What happens in the poem? So this is a summary. Ask what it all means. Once you've pinned down literally what's happening in the poem, then I want you to take a leap into what's figuratively happening. So what's the significance of the poem? Are there any figures of speech? Are there metaphors or similes? Is there any sound work going on? You really want to, what is the author using to convey meaning in the poem? Then you want to consider the poem's shape on the page and the way it sounds. Are there line breaks? What words begin the lines? What words end the lines? Are they more important than the other words? And how is the poem? Is it in stanzas, or is it broken into stanzas? Is it just one large block? Think about it as you're thinking through the poem. So the two types of writing that we're going to be doing, and you'll get to choose one or the other, is a comparison and contrast paper or an analysis paper. So when you write a comparison contrast paper, and there's a sample paper on page 1948 in our book, so please read that if this is the type of paper you're going to read. You're going to place two poems side by side and study their differences and similarities in order to shed light on both works. You're going to pair two poems that already have much in common. So you'll want to pick out two that are similar. Maybe they're by the same author, or they're on similar themes, or they're set in similar places. Then you want to, whatever is obviously there, you'll know, and then you want to closely read in order to point to further unsuspected resemblances. How else are they alike that you hadn't noticed before? Then you want to show noteworthy differences. How are these poems different, and how does that affect the meaning? When you're writing a comparison and contrast paper in literature, you want to carefully consider your paper's organization. So why are you comparing these two poems? And are you going to, what's the purpose of your paper? What is the purpose of your comparison? And you want to set up your paper to represent that. So maybe you'll have part of your paper on one poem, on the similarities, and part of your paper on the differences, and then what the meaning, the overall meaning is based on these, this comparison and contrast. There's a lot of different ways to set it up. It depends on what you'll be arguing in your thesis. So you'll need to do a comparison and contrast for a purpose. Analysis is when you separate the poem into elements as a means to understand that subject. So you want to look closely at one or two elements, such as figures of speech, sound, or imagery, and show how this element of the poem contributes to the meaning of the whole of the poem. So how are all the images conveying the meaning in the poem, or how are the images and the euphony and the alliteration and accidents conveying the lyric, the meaning in this lyric poem by Emily Dickinson. Now there's a sample paper on page 1946 for you to take a look at. Please note how papers are structured in this book. That is in MLA format. I expect all of you to be well versed in this. If you're not, come see me in my office hours and I will help you set up your paper. But you will lose points if your paper is not set up in MLA format. All of these sample papers show you the proper heading and the proper way to lay out your paper with a 1-inch margin all the way around, your last name and the page number up in the right hand corner, and a works cited page on the last page. Yes, it's okay to use outside sources. Most likely you'll be using biographies about the poets that I've given you links to, or you'll be using our book, or you'll be using a dictionary. If you're using other sources and you have questions about it, please come see me. So another thing that's really important in writing a successful paper about poetry is quoting poetry, which is a little different than quoting prose. If you look on pages 1950 to 1952, you'll see some really great examples of how to quote poetry. So when you quote just a few lines, you want to indicate whenever you're just going to transform that those lines as part of the prose in your paper, but you'll indicate if there's a line break with 1 slash or a stanza break with 2 slashes. And I have an example here. So the color white preoccupies Frost. That's the author's words. The spider is, and this is a quotation from the poem, fat and white, period. That slash there, that means a line break in the poem. On a white heel all. Notice right after that, after the quotation mark, there's parentheses, and it says the number 1-2. That means that fat and white and on a white heel come from lines 1 and 2 in the poem. And then the author of the paper just continues with the prose, and even the victim moth is pale too. And that's a paraphrase of the next few lines of the poem. When you quote 4 or more lines, you set the lines off from your text and arrange them just as they occur on the page, white space and all. And there's an example down here. At the end of the poem, the poet asks what deity or fate cursed this particular mutant flower, and you can see that the quotation starts midway through the line, so I set it off midway through the line with being white, and the whole quotation from the poem is indented 1 inch from the left-hand margin. It's double spaced between quoted lines. You type the poem exactly like it appears in the original, exactly including punctuation, and you don't need quotation marks. You want to cite the line numbers you're quoting in parentheses. There's more information too on omitting words. You only use ellipses in a quotation if you are omitting words. You never begin with ellipses in a quotation. That's ... Quoting only a brief phrase. There's no need for an ellipsis if it's obvious that only a phrase is being quoted, so you don't have to put ... before. But if you're omitting full lines of verse, you want to indicate that omission by spaced periods about the length of a line of the poem that you're quoting. And there's an example of that on page 1951. Alright, so when you're getting ready to write, you're going to start with pre-writing, and on pages 1935 through 38, there are examples. We went over these briefly last time for your fiction, but there is brainstorming, and that's where you just free associate. You're going to read the poem, have it in front of you, and just start free associating words and ideas, writing them down on the page. Or if you're more visual, you can do a cluster, and the same thing. If you read a poem like God's Grandeur, and shine out like shook foil makes you think of tin foil, makes you think of crows, makes you think of, you let your brain go. Another way to do the same thing is to list, is free associate writing a list. My favorite and way to pre-write for a paper is to do a free write, and that's where I give myself 15 minutes where I just put my pen on a piece of paper or put my fingers on the keyboard and I write whatever's on my mind about that poem. Whatever I'm thinking, I just write it. Don't worry about grammar, don't worry about spelling, anything, I just write. A journal entry is a little bit more formal. This is a way that if you're feeling like you want to start piecing together your ideas, maybe you did a free write and now you want to think through what exactly do I want to think about, so you underline a line or two in your free write and you focus in a journal about what you want to focus on, and then you can start outlining. So maybe you know what you want to focus on and you're trying to think of, okay, what order do I want to develop my paper in, and you start thinking that through in an outline. Alright, so with all this talk of writing about poetry, here's what you're going to be writing about poetry. You're going to write a 5 to 6 page paper, and it'll be in Times New Roman 12-point font. You need to have it in MLA format, as I showed you in the book. There's some examples, and you're going to choose one of the 2 following prompts. You can choose either one. The first one is to compare and contrast any 2 poems by a single poet found in our textbook. I've listed here some of the poets that are double listed in our book. There are more, so if none of these are speaking to you, go ahead and look through. If you really like this prompt and you found a poet that you really like, and you can't find the second poem in our book, but you find it on poets.org or the Poetry Foundation, that's fine, but you need to clear it with me, okay? Or if that's not speaking to you, you can write an analysis of a poem of your choice, where you research the poem, the poet, and the context of the poem, and argue a meaning based on your research. You can find great biographies of all the poets featured in our book at poets.org or the Poetry Foundation. All papers must use direct quotations from the poems, just like what we were talking about. They must be correct and show an understanding of the terminology we've been learning in regards to the elements of poetry. This paper will be due April 29th at 11:59 p.m. You've got some time to work on it, and in your reflection journal this week, you will be beginning to work on it. So you want to start doing your poem selection and doing your pre-writing to really think about what it is you want to write about. Try out some poems, see if they're speaking to you. Okay? And the great news is we have conferences this week, so if you're confused and you have questions, bring them to me and I'm happy to answer them. Alright guys, that's it for this week. I apologize for the longer lecture. I just wanted to make sure you guys really knew how to write about poetry. Next week, we're still going to be doing poetry. It's our last week. We're going to be looking at the poet Sappho, who I wrote my dissertation partially on, so it's pretty fun for me. We're going to be, it'll be a lighter week because I know you'll be working on your papers, but we will still be working hard and understanding myth and narrative in poetry. Alright guys, I look forward to seeing you online.